In a previous video, I talked about stopping in the Tesla and the fact that it doesn't do a dip when you come to a stop sign. So I kind of was musing about the way it stops and how that works. And one of my listeners, Dermot, asked a question about whether the dual motor actually does dip at a stop sign. And the answer, as far as I can tell, is no, it's the same thing. And that got me to thinking about why. Why doesn't the Tesla dip, but a traditional car does? And so I did a little research. I wanted to know a little bit more. And the reason has everything to do with the design of the car. So think about your car. Your traditional engine car has the frame. It's the metal part that's underneath. The axles are attached to it. Then you have the chassis that's on top of that. And the chassis is most of the body of the car. And then within there, in the front part of it, is the engine. And the engine is the heaviest component in the car, the single component in the car. And so that is a very heavy thing. Now there's a whole bunch of suspension pieces, and then you've got your springs and other pieces that actually maintain how the car maintains its weight and its balance. And the center of gravity is then going to be a little bit up from the bottom of the car. So the frame itself is not going to be it's not going to be where the center of gravity is. It's going to be up a little bit. There's a calculation you can do to figure out exactly where the center of gravity is between various types of cars, but it's going to be up from the ground a little bit just because of the nature of the weight of the engine and the weight of the chassis that's on the car. And so therefore you have the car itself is kind of heavy, and this very heavy object in the front of the car, when you're accelerating the car, the engine will lean back a little bit, so the car will actually tip back slightly, almost imperceptibly as you're driving. But then when you stop, it's going to go forward. That's the nature of the physics of it, and the way the suspension works, and the way the chassis and the suspension and everything fit together. That's just the way the traditional engine works. So kind of an interesting thing that happens there. It's not uncommon in any car. Some cars are more pronounced than others, and newer cars have less of a tendency to dip just because they use the suspension differently, and there's more electronics and some other things in there that control how the suspension works. The difference with a Tesla, whether it's a dual motor, single motor, or whatever, is the fact that they recreated the way the car is constructed. They've created something called the skate, and that's the bottom part of the car. And the skate, instead of having a frame and then a chassis, the skate is sort of most of the frame and the batteries and the suspension. That's one piece. So you've got the heaviest part of the car is actually down in the thing that's called the skate. And the skate then is where your center of gravity is. It's very low because the batteries are underneath the car. And as you can see in this diagram, the batteries actually extend from basically through the passenger cabin. So they start right at the end of the frunk and go all the way to where the trunk is. That's the way the design goes. So you have this thing that comes together as a skate, is what they call it, and that actually maintains the weight of the car. Then on top of that is the chassis. They put the chassis on top. But the chassis in this case is a lightweight aluminum instead of being steel or polymers like most other car companies use. This is Tesla reinvented the materials and came up with a way to make it a lighter weight so that they could actually put it on the car and it would actually not change the weight of the car. The important thing in the electric cars is to keep your weight down. The less weight you have in the car, the more efficient your batteries can be because the less weight they have to pull. You want to pull, you want to make sure the car is heavy enough to withstand accidents and designed in a way that does that, but you want to keep the weight down into a minimum as much as you can. So that's the way you do it, by creating these different things like the skate and then the chassis that sits on top of it. And because of the way the skate is designed with its specific suspension pieces, and these are sort of electronically controlled suspensions, though there's air and other things in them. They work a little bit differently than traditional suspensions, or what we knew as the traditional suspensions. I know other car companies are coming along to different ways of looking at it too, but the idea then is that you have a car that has its center of gravity that's very low, has no engine in the front that's going to move and make the car go up and down as you're driving, so therefore there is no dip, and that's why there isn't one. It's a pretty simple explanation, and the physics works really well when you start to think about it from that perspective. You can do the math and figure out where the center of gravity is. You can do the math and figure out how heavy the engine is and figure out how much it's going to rotate based on whether you're accelerating or decelerating. So, you think about a car, the engine's up here, a traditional car, it's going to drive along, and if you try and stop, the engine is going to have to move down. That's the only thing you can do, is move down. Because the weight of the engine, it's going to dip like that. When you don't have that weight in the front, it's just going to move along. And that's it. So you're going to stop and you'll come to zero. So that's why it doesn't work that way. And it doesn't matter if it's a dual motor or a single motor, because the motors are actually underneath, down by the axles. They're under my feet in the car. They're not up any higher than that. So the motors themselves don't matter where they are. Yeah, there's one in the back and one in the front, but all that does is just distribute the weight a little differently. There's no dip. There's nothing that happens there. So I just wanted to take some time and explain that. Once I went and thought about it, I was like, wow, it makes perfectly good sense to me. You know, I'm a scientist and engineer by trade, so this is the kind of thing that fascinates me. And when you start thinking about the math behind it and sort of how it comes together, kind of interesting and fascinating. And I thought I'd spend a couple of minutes and just talk about that, because it's not what you expect necessarily, but it works really well when you actually stop and think about how they designed it. They redesigned the entire car. It is a different construction than a traditional car, and that's why there's no dip. Pretty cool.